what's particularly serious about this case is that the perpetrator had actually killed before. So there were very extensive powers to recall him to prison if there was any further offending. And we're talking about low levels of offending that should trigger recall.
I sentence you to imprisonment for life.
Will spend the rest of his life behind bars.
Court is required to make a whole life order.
Never be released from prison. A rare whole life term.
And you will never be considered for parole.
The Games of the 30th Olympiad in 2012 are awarded to the city of London. London.
We did it. London will host the 2012 Olympic Games.
In April of 2012, as the country was gearing up towards the international spectacle of the London Olympics, the Parole Board was releasing a prisoner. Just 23 months after his release, he would commit the same horrific crime he had originally gone to prison for. This harrowing case takes us back almost 3 decades to the chilly March of 1998. My Heart Will Go On was dominating the charts, and the movie the song was the theme for, Titanic, had just swept the 70th Academy Awards, winning a total of 11 Oscars. One person who had loved the historical romance was a 20-year-old girl from Oldham, Janine Waterworth. She was well known and well liked around her hometown for her lovely smile and contagious laugh. In the previous week, she'd broken up with her possessive and jealous boyfriend, 28-year-old Paul O'Hara, and she had moved back in with her parents in Higher Crompton until she got back on her feet. Janine had been living with Paul and one of his relatives in a cramped 2-bedroom flat over Tennyson Street, and although she had been trying to make it work for a while, she'd decided that the flat and Paul just weren't really what she wanted out of life. Her parents had been right after all. Although they couldn't quite put a finger on why, they'd never really liked Paul and felt there was just something off about him. Both her mother and father had been against the relationship from the beginning and warned their daughter not to get involved with him. Janine's mother Vera said, "I didn't like him anyway, so when she said she was moving in with him and asked for help, we weren't comfortable with that. He was devious. He slept here a few nights and he was polite, and we couldn't see too much wrong." Paul O'Hara had a bad reputation around Oldham, and it was a reputation that was very much deserved. He'd been in and out of trouble with the law frequently since being released from a young offenders institution, mostly for crimes like shoplifting, burglary or joyriding. But after turning 21, his crimes had become much more violent, and he had become much more volatile. In 1991, he was arrested for severely beating someone with a baseball bat, and a few years after that, he was jailed again for assaulting police officers. He was later convicted again, this time for grievously wounding a man who was walking home from work, because Paul had liked the look of the man's jacket and wanted to steal it. He would also later be convicted of causing grievous bodily harm, after he broke a woman's arm and knocked another unconscious during an argument. Paul O'Hara was in and out of prison all the time, and he didn't seem to care who he hurt. Janine's parents were unaware of his criminal nature. Ian later said, "The first I knew about his record was in the paper. We knew nothing about it before, but she wouldn't have been with him if we did. He was a lonely, withdrawn person who didn't have a lot of male friends. The only person he really got on with was his grandma." Most who knew him avoided him at all costs, but not Janine. She had been attracted to him since they first met, and believed that he was fundamentally a good person in his heart, and thought that she would be able to help him get on and stay on the straight and narrow. It wasn't long after they moved in together, however, that Janine realised what kind of man he was. He drank almost every day and was a habitual drug user, which made his jealousies, insecurities and paranoias even worse. He hardly worked and couldn't hold down a job, even on the rare occasions he did find employment. He demanded to know where she was at all times and would interrogate her when she got home from work, about who she had spoken to while she'd been away. It wasn't long into the relationship when the violence started. Those who were closest to her noticed that Janine wasn't smiling or laughing in the way she had before. She seemed anxious and jumpy all the time. She was living her daily life as though she was constantly walking on eggshells, always worried about what his reactions might be, always frightened about him going into one of his rages. Would it be a comment spoken offhandedly that would be misconstrued, leading him to exploding? Or would it be if she happened to incidentally make eye contact with a stranger on the street? By March of 1998, physically and mentally exhausted, Janine had finally had enough and left Paul O'Hara. She told him that she needed space and was moving back in with her parents for a little while to get her head straight. The man who had abused her for months was now begging and pleading. The way it seemed he could so easily and quickly change had often surprised Janine throughout their relationship, switching back and forth from the sweet and funny man she'd initially fallen for into a raging and terrifying monster who was violent and under the influence of drugs and alcohol. Unbeknownst to Janine and nearly all of those who knew him, Paul O'Hara had a severe kind of personality disorder that made him essentially a ticking time bomb. Along with the acts of violence, these rapid and jarring transitions between moods were huge red flags. But in 1998, many didn't know as much about personality disorders as they do today, and Janine, always believing in the best in others, continued to see him occasionally in the week after the breakup, in the hopes that he could really change. However, when he became obsessed with the idea that Janine had found someone else, and began turning up on her parents' doorstep at all hours of the day and night, fueled by drink, drugs and sleepless evenings, demanding to know who she had been seeing, she had finally had enough and told him they were completely through, and she meant it this time. Three days later, on the morning of March the 27th, the sounds of birdsong filled the air as Janine walked from her parents' house to the nearby bus stop. It was almost 6:30, and the bus would be there any minute. This was Janine's usual route on the day she had work. Tragically, Paul O'Hara also knew this routine, and on that day he was hiding in an alleyway close to the bus stop on Trent Road, a carving knife gripped tightly in his hand. As she neared the bus stop, Paul O'Hara jumped out and dragged her into the alleyway, where he stabbed her a total of 12 times, with such a brutal ferocity that the blade of the carving knife snapped off inside her. Blood-drenched, Paul fled the scene, leaving Janine to bleed to death. Throughout the sustained attack, Janine had screamed for help, and although her cries were heard by multiple neighbours, nobody went out to help until it was too late. Janine died at the scene just 400 yards from her parents' home. Paul allegedly told family members, "I think I've killed Janine. I can't believe I've done it. I just lost it." 3 hours later, he was found, drunkenly wandering around Oldham city centre and placed under arrest. Whilst in custody, he admitted to stabbing Janine to death and was charged with her murder the following morning. On the 24th of November 1998, Paul O'Hara was found guilty of murdering his ex-girlfriend and sentenced to life in prison at Manchester Crown Court. He allegedly passed out in the dock and was on the verge of tears as he was led away to begin his sentence. Whilst in prison, he was tested numerous times by criminal psychologists, who believed his results displayed high levels of psychopathy in his psychological makeup, and despite telephoning Janine's parents from prison in a half-hearted attempt at an apology, he never truly displayed any genuine remorse for taking their daughter's life. When he was in prison, he rang to apologise. "I didn't register who it was at first because my daughter has a husband called Paul, so I thought it was him. I told O'Hara, 'Sorry means nothing now,' her father said." Whilst locked up, Paul, who was used to bullying people he deemed weaker and smaller, was unable to intimidate the other inmates, who looked down on those who killed women or children. In April of 2012, as Olympics fever gripped the nation, Paul O'Hara was released early from prison, on licence, despite many prison psychologists believing he still posed a significant threat to vulnerable women. It's more likely that a prisoner will be released early on licence if their sentence is less than 4 years, and they've shown genuine signs of remorse. There are, however, a number of strict rules that they must adhere to, unless they want to be sent back to prison to fulfil the remaining years of their sentence. These rules are that all releasees must keep in contact with a supervising officer, they must live at an approved residential address, they must not partake in drugs or alcohol, and they must find full-time employment. It was somewhat surprising at the time, as well as today, that the parole board actually deemed him eligible for premature freedom. He was the complete opposite of most of those who were granted an early release. but as the parole board received increasing amounts of pressure from the government to free up space in England's prisons, they assumed he was completely rehabilitated. They would be proven tragically wrong. "40-year-old mother of one Shirley Shannon, or just Shez to her nearest and dearest, was always someone who tried to better herself in life. She loved keeping busy and always had new projects on the go. She had originally owned a beauty salon called Sheer Bliss in the town of Waterford, Lancashire, where she was known as a lovely, funny and chatty woman who could make even the shyest of people feel relaxed. One of her customers said everyone would go to Shez when they had a problem or anything and wanted guidance, and she was always there. She loved cooking and would make delicious cheesecake which she would give out to customers at the salon, something that made her immensely popular. When she wasn't working in the salon, people often saw her walking around Waterford with her 5 energetic Akita dogs. One of her family members said she was easy to get along with and used to be laughing all the time. Everything was a joke, even when she used her family as guinea pigs for her potions at her beauty salon. She was someone who was constantly searching for new challenges, so in 2009 she went back to college. She decided she was going to study forensic science and also started working as a carer for those who lived in assisted living. She was someone who treated every single day as if it were a gift and wanted to get the most out of life as she could. When her beauty salon went out of business, she didn't let this get her down either. Instead, she threw herself into a new project. This time she opened up a second-hand furniture store in Hayward, Greater Manchester, with Graham, her partner and father of her 10-year-old daughter. It wasn't long before the business was going from strength to strength, and tired of helping Graham lug all the furniture around, she put out an advert for extra staff. Although they were still extraordinarily close and loved spending time with one another, after 16 years together, Graham and Shirley had started living separate romantic lives, and as she turned 40, she longed for romance and someone to share her life with again. In July of 2013, Paul O'Hara applied for the job at the second-hand furniture store, and he began working in the shop soon after initially meeting her. It wasn't long before he completely loved Bomb Shirley into believing he was someone he wasn't. She told friends at the time that he came across as a big, cuddly teddy bear who made her smile. The pair's relationship seemed happy for a while, but as the weeks turned into months, Paul's mask began to slip. The 5th of November, 2013. Bonfire night. Shirley's family gathered for their annual bonfire night party. Her sister said, "We used to have a big family party every year, everybody used to go. Shirley used to make treacle toffee, 3 types. She'd do toffee apples, baked pies and make cheesecakes. She made it incredible." However, as she walked into the family gathering, everybody was shocked to see her face was badly bruised and cut. They were even more horrified that she had trouble talking because her jaw had been fractured and her nose broken. When family members inspected her face and demanded to know what on earth had happened, she waved them off, saying she had tripped and fallen down the stairs because she'd been drunk and wearing high heels. Sadly, she was not being honest with her family in a desperate attempt to protect the man she had become terrified of. He had been mercilessly beating her often because he was enraged and jealous over the relationship she had with her ex-partner Graham. On one occasion, Paul had punched her so hard in the face, he had knocked her unconscious. When she woke up over an hour later, she found him sleeping on the sofa. When she asked him why he had left her unconscious on the floor like that, he allegedly shrugged and replied, "I thought you were dead. I didn't know what to do." The violence became more frequent and severe. Her cheekbone was smashed on one occasion because she had been talking to Graham about custody of their now 11-year-old. She had been headbutted, kicked in the stomach, and even held hostage at knife point for hours on one occasion. Paul had threatened to kill her and her ex-partner and demanded to know where she was, who she was with, and what she was doing at all times of the day. She had just wanted someone to build her life with, but her life was now a living, breathing nightmare. She was afraid to talk to others, frightened of leaving the house. She was exactly where Paul O'Hara wanted her to be, completely under his control. However, during a 5-hour telephone call with another one of her sisters, Ellen, she broke down in tears and finally told her sister of the hellish ordeal she'd been enduring for so long. Ellen told Graham and the rest of the family, and they urged Shirley to contact the police. As he was out on licence, the violent attacks and domestic abuse should have seen him rearrested and sent back to prison straight away. and that was exactly what she was hoping for when she telephoned her boyfriend's parole officer. But after visiting her at home briefly, officers treated her allegations of domestic violence as a historic incident, and despite her having visible injuries to her face and clearly being frightened, no attempts were made to apprehend Paul O'Hara at all. What made the situation even worse was that he was made aware by law enforcement that she had made complaints against him, and he was advised to give her space. Instead of leaving her alone, he beat her and forced her to tell the police officers who visited 2 days later to do a follow-up that she had made all of the allegations up. While she informed the officers of this scripted and bogus information, Paul hid in a cupboard and closely scrutinised his terrified girlfriend's actions through a crack in the door, making sure she followed his script. However, one thing he had failed to take into account was just how much she loved her daughter. On the 17th of March, when he made threatening remarks against her daughter, she waited for him to leave and then immediately called the police to inform them of everything that had been happening to her for the last several months. She pleaded with them to come and arrest him for breaking the terms of his parole. Just over an hour later, 2 domestic violence officers, Detective Sergeant Damien McAllister and Detective Constable Karen Kenworthy, turned up at the address. Just down the street and sitting behind the wheel of his car, Paul observed the arrival of the 2 officers. He had armed himself with a hammer, jogged down the street, and went around the house to the back door. He let himself in, where he ambushed the 2 officers and his girlfriend, and in the same way he had ambushed Janine in the alleyway all those years before, he took a carving knife from the kitchen and burst into the living room, striking DS McAllister repeatedly over the head, knocking him unconscious. He then threatened Karen Kenworthy with the carving knife before chasing a screaming Cheryl Lee out onto the street, where he stabbed her repeatedly in front of multiple witnesses, who could only stand by and watch helplessly as she fell to her knees, and he carried on his relentless attack. Backup officers arrived on scene and finally were able to subdue him. However, for Cheryl Lee, it was too late. She was pronounced dead at the scene, and all the paramedics could do was quickly take her body away before her daughter arrived home from school. For her family, the devastation was impossible to put into words. Her mother Betty said that she was their rock. She was a beautiful, caring, kind daughter, sister, mother, but she's gone, taken from us by a monster with a known history of violence to women, on a life licence for the murder of a previous partner. Probation and police had all the information they needed to stop this, but they let it happen. We as a family have to live with that knowledge, and without Cheryl Lee for the rest of our lives. Her sister Siobhan added, knowledge is power, and probation and police both had the knowledge and the power to prevent Cheryl Lee's killing. If they had used them, she would still be with us today. Cheryl Lee was fed to the wolves by the very people that were supposed to protect her. We urge the police and probation to learn the lessons from Cheryl Lee's case, so that women facing domestic abuse are protected. In June 2014, just over 2 years after he had been released early from prison, Paul O'Hara was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole at Preston Crown Court. A whole life order, meaning he will die in prison. In a statement, the parole board said it deeply regretted the circumstances surrounding her murder. In cases such as this one, the board is committed to doing everything it can to learn the lessons that will help prevent further tragedies. To this end, the parole board has a review committee which includes 2 senior independent figures to identify any lessons that need to be learned for the future. The parole board takes its responsibility to protect the public extremely seriously. Parole board members are appointed through a rigorous assessment process and provided with intensive training to undertake the role. When deciding whether or not to release a prisoner, the protection of the public is always their primary concern.
I mean, I believe that she didn't know that everything until, because she was treated as an employer rather than a partner. So it was, for me, it was 5 or 6 months, if it's what's come out of the inquest, that she knew. And she was shocked. It was noted from probation when actually they did meet her face to face that she was shocked. So he'd clearly not told her.
So you were finding out things in the inquest that she didn't know. That was just this summer.
Yeah,
I understand there was a phone conversation with the probation service with her. Can you tell us about that?
I don't know about that, but what I do know from the inquest, or what I feel that I know, is that the phone call that she got was simply, has he told you about his past? And she was on the other end of the phone saying, yes, he has, and he was behind her, apparently at knife point. So that's what I have learned.
What's particularly serious about this case is that the perpetrator had actually killed before. He'd been released, he'd killed his previous partner, and he was on a life licence, which is what happens if you're convicted of a previous killing. So there were very extensive powers to recall him to prison if there was any further offending, and we're talking about low levels of offending that should trigger recall. And yet, this offender was allowed to enter into a relationship, to become abusive, and despite the fact that the abuse was reported to the authorities, he wasn't recalled to prison, and Cheryl paid with her life. And part of the problem is the attitude to domestic abuse. Too often it's too easy to disbelieve the woman. We know that Cheryl withdrew her allegations. She made very, very clear allegations to the authorities, and then she withdrew them. And we know, as Siobhan's mentioned, she withdrew because when she withdrew, he was hiding in a cupboard with a knife. She was being visited by police officers and he was in the cupboard. She put on the performance of her life. That is what abused women will do.
After Cheryl murder, Janine's father, Ian, reached out a hand of friendship and support to her family. Paul O'Hara's whole life order is a sentence that reflects the gravity of what he did, but it's one that comes far too late. What remains is hardest to sit with. It's not just the violence itself, but the isolation that surrounded it. Patterns of control and fear are often invisible from the outside, especially when abuse happens behind closed doors, and victims are left feeling alone, ashamed, or unsure of where to turn. Cases like this force us to confront uncomfortable questions about how warning signs are recognised or missed. Domestic abuse does not begin with murder. It escalates through incidents that may seem minor in isolation, but together form a clear and dangerous pattern. If those moments aren't taken seriously, if they aren't recorded, shared, and acted upon, the opportunity to intervene is lost. There are so many victims in this story, not only Cheryl and Janine, but the people who loved them and the wider communities who were left trying to understand how this could happen. It's impossible not to feel that this case could have ended differently, and that feeling matters because we cannot protect people from risks that we don't fully see and don't really understand. We cannot prevent harm if the systems meant to respond only react once it's already too late. If you or someone you know has been affected by any of the issues raised in today's episode, we have left links to further resources in the description box below.